Welcome to the New Monastics podcast, where we'll be discussing all aspects of the contemplative life and interspirituality in the context of modernity. On each episode, we will choose a topic to explore with one of today's leading teachers or thinkers. The New Monastics podcast is a project of Charis Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality, which is dedicated to the emergence of a newly conceived contemplative life of embodied spirituality and sacred activism.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the New Monastics podcast. Today we wanted to do something a little bit different. We often have guests. We've done one episode with just Netanel and I dialoguing together, and we wanted to do another episode like that. But given Netanel has been acting as a dialogue partner with our guests, I wanted to give an opportunity to treat Netanel as a guest in his own right. Though Netanel has shared pieces of his teachings and work throughout the podcast, I'd like to give him a full introduction as we do with our other guests. So Netanel Miles-Yépez is an artist, writer, scholar of religion, and spiritual teacher. He is considered a leading thinker in the interspiritual and new monasticism movements, and serves as the current head of the Inayati Maimuni lineage of Sufism. He is the founder and manager of Albion Andalus Books, the co-founder and director of Charis Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality, and a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. We've talked a lot so far on this podcast about particular spiritual and religious traditions, and we could certainly dive into the interspiritual matrix and lineages you're connected to, or the extensive amount of books you've written, edited, or worked on in another capacity. But today I want to take us in a different direction. Aside from your work as a writer, professor, spiritual teacher, you're also quite the accomplished visual artist, specifically a drawer and painter. So today I'd like to focus our dialogue on the intersection of art and spirituality. In our private conversations, you've shared a sense that the artist and teacher in you are two authentic but distinct dimensions of your being. And I feel like in this context, we often get more of a taste of your professorial or spiritual teacher side. So I'm hoping to coax out a little more of Netanel the artist, if you will. To start us off, I have a couple questions that I'm happy for you to run with wherever you're so inspired. Can you describe the crossroads where the teacher and artist meet inside of you, and how the artist side of your being informs your spiritual life? And more generally, how do you view the role of art in a spiritual or new monastic lifestyle?
The crossroads for me goes like this. Over the years, I've had, an internal dialogue, trying to figure out, where all these things fit in my life. In fact, when I was pretty young, it was hard to manage all the different life possibilities. Would I be a writer? Would I be an artist? Would I be a philosopher? Or would I be a religion scholar? And it just seemed like there were all these possibilities, and in some ways, it just kind of shut me down. Mm-hmm. Too many possibilities. You gotta walk a road. You can't walk all roads. And later on, I learned that that's true and untrue. Like, I carry all those roads with me, and I sometimes take these side trips down them. But the way I think about it now is that I have a lot more awareness now that my basic archetype is artist. You could think of an archetype of a cerebral scholar. I'm not that. Mm-hmm. My archetype is artist, which means that most of the things that I do run through that archetype, whether they seem to be related to art or not. And so, my inner artist tends to be passionate, creative. And so if we're dealing with, even when I was a therapist dealing with, an issue with a person, I often handled it very much like an artist. I wasn't clinical about it. It wasn't trying to diagnose them in a specific way. I was very open to the moment and very willing to not pre-plan how I would answer or address them, but allow it to arise. And so this is a thing that I do very naturally, and it's an expression of being an artist. Coming into a teaching situation, I don't like to pre-plan the whole thing either. I'll give myself some cues to go from but I like to see what happens. And so that's been a very important distinction for me, or understanding to come to, that that's my frame. That's the filter through which everything happens. And it's really the difficulty of other people, how they want to define you. And that's still sometimes difficult for me, the projections around being a spiritual teacher as opposed to an artist. You'd have totally different projections and preconceptions to deal with either way.
Mm-hmm. It seems that in some ways the artist gets a lot more leeway than the spiritual teacher.
Way more.
So maybe going back a little bit, I'm just curious if you can share with the audience where the actual creation of your visual art does factor into your life. Less on the archetypal mode, but in just a practical sense, you draw, you paint, you produce art. How does that factor into your life?
Well, I've been in a period lately where there's been kind of a poverty of art, and I feel diminished by it. Like I've been doing so much public teaching and doing so much writing that I haven't been producing much art. And I always take that, it's part of the rhythms of life, but I always realize that I'm probably not in very good shape if I'm not doing art. Something's missing, and I won't be healthy for very long if I'm not doing it. And so I've been in such a period lately. And so actually, yesterday was a day where I got out a bunch of paintings and got out some different materials and was working on an ink painting. So, I can take the measure of my kind of psycho-spiritual health by whether I'm painting or not. And where it comes in, how does it come in? I think, I don't know exactly what you're asking, but these things arise as a need. If you go from that artist archetype, the origin of a book or an article or a talk is not that different from the origin of a painting for me. Mm-hmm. There's some sort of seed or upwelling that wants to get expressed. As a visual artist, I can remember getting a kind of vague, abstract notion of something wanting to come through. And the more I give some attention to that vague, abstract notion, it starts to take on characteristics. I can see an image. And I don't want to overstate that like it's perfectly, every line is perfectly there. No, it's more like a target. Mm-hmm. There's a feel around it. There may be colors associated with it. There is a definite image, but it's not like carved in stone, not sharp. But it's true, and it's there. And I can tell as I start to work whether I'm getting closer to it or further from it. Mm-hmm. And that's what I mean by it being, it has a definiteness, but it's not a definite image. The definiteness is I know when I'm on or off in pursuing it. Mm-hmm. And not everything comes with real power that way, but they all have some characteristic like that. But a lot of my bigger and better paintings have come from a very clear image arising in my mind. Mm-hmm. Clear in this other sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems clear that for you, creating art, and I'm curious if also consuming art, is deeply spiritual nourishing. And you're speaking to this period of your life now where it's almost a sense of imbalance, that there's not enough space to create that art. So I'm wondering if you can unpack a little bit how you feel art to be nourishing. What is your experience of being nourished by art? What do you feel that art provides for you that other mediums do not?
The nourishment comes in the doing of it. Not in just in the doing, but also in the accomplishment. And this may be particular to me. Mm-hmm. Like if I've finished a painting and I've reached, I've accomplished that kind of expression of that vision, I don't have to keep the painting. It doesn't hurt to give it away or to sell it. Maybe less so if I've got a photograph of it that's really good, you know. I don't want to lose it either. But the thing is done. And it's kind of like a process is done. And not all of them reach that sense of completion. Some it's like, not as good as I could have done, but it is done. And I'm not going to go back and repaint it. But a lot of them are just products from the unconscious, from the superconscious, that want to come through, and I'm midwifing. And there's a great sense of satisfaction around the midwifing of them. And the articulation, the getting closer to a vision where it feels like, something has been contributed to the universe. So that's the way it's nourishing to me. I don't actually enjoy looking at a lot of visual art. I'm kind of picky about it. I don't actually enjoy hanging out with other visual artists for the most part. I like talking about art with other artists, but not necessarily visual artists. And if I'm fed by other arts, it's usually music. Sometimes fed by visual arts, but it's usually I'm looking for a quality that I want in my painting. And wherever I see it reflected, then that's something that feeds me. But it's not like visual art in general. It's kind of cannibalistic or opportunistic, like it's for feeding this inner animal, which is voracious for its own expression. But being fed, mostly in music, and I have that thing like many artists of different types, we're often jealous of each other. Like, you might be a good visual artist, but you want to be a writer or a musician. And I have that thing definitely around music, deep passion for music, and yet it's not my mode of expression. At least I don't have the skill for it.
You saying when you view visual art, there's almost that sense of looking for a kind of quality that you want to represent in your own art is reminding me of your reflections of seeing some other painters. And I believe it was Van Gogh, where you've seen some of his paintings and it almost frustrated you because it was so good and so alive that it felt almost unreachable for yourself. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that quality of a painting that does really strike you, even if you are picky, the things that you look at and say, that's awesome. What is it that strikes you about that kind of art?
Well, there's two things. I mean, one, I was just mentioning like this kind of voracious animal. That's the artist inside me is passionate for its own expression. And sometimes I see things in other paintings that feel like they belong to me, which is to say, like they belong to that inner vision, which is clear but vague at the same time. And I'll see those elements in another painter's painting and know it belongs to my vision somehow. Mm-hmm. It's an aspect of it, and there they've got it. And I've seen it reflected, and now I'm honing in. And so that's one aspect of that. With Van Gogh, I had two experiences. One, I was in just a little shop that had things from France, cookware and all kinds of, wonderful things you get only imported from France. And there was a postcard of a Van Gogh painting, and not even a famous Van Gogh painting, not, the Starry Night that everybody sees, not the cypresses that everybody sees, but it was a sun-soaked landscape, probably a cornfield or wheat field, and the sun was either rising or going down because it has that reddish quality. And I saw this postcard, and I felt something akin to anger. It was not anger. It was red-hot jealousy because there was so much life in that painting, so much richness, so much heart. I don't want to paint a landscape. I'm not a landscape painter. I have no interest in painting trees and, pastoral landscapes, none whatsoever. So it's not like what he painted. It was how he painted it. And I grabbed that postcard. I went right to the cash register and I paid the $1.50 for it, almost stomping. I took it home and I put it right on the fridge to stare at me every day because it annoyed me. And I'm a little like that. Like, I like challenges, fierce challenges. And that felt like the gauntlet was thrown down. Like, if I'm going to paint it all, I want to put some of that quality in my paintings. And that's what it was, I had so admired it that I was furious about about not having harnessed that to a degree that I was happy with. Another painting of his, it was a subject, again, I cared nothing about whatsoever. I was in the Phillips Museum in Washington, D.C., and they had just a brilliant exhibit of, 3 or 4 different masters. And they had maybe 6 or 7 Van Goghs up in a private room. And it was 2 fish on a plate. 2 fish on a plate. Like, I can't imagine painting fish on a plate. Like, it seems like the most ridiculous waste of time for me to paint fish on a plate. But looking at them, they just vibrated with life. Now, they were dead fish on a plate, obviously. They vibrated with his life, his intensity. And I looked at those and I just shook my head again. I'm like, what is going on with this man that he can put the vibration of his being and his own intensity into the painting? And it's the way I look at paintings. They either live or they don't. They're alive or they're not. Mm-hmm. And it's a judgment I make when I look at paintings.
Yeah, that raises the question for me around spiritual attunement, or a kind of latent spirituality that, from my own bias, kind of being interested in these things, that's how it seems, is that an artist who produces a work that has that quality of richness and aliveness inevitably feels tapped in to a kind of alive spiritual source, even if externally there's nothing quote unquote spiritual, or certainly not religious traditional imagery per se. I'm wondering if you can speak to that. What is your sense of the kind of spirit that is coming through artists, even regardless of any quote unquote spiritual content? Like you're saying with the fish on the plate.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, at this moment, I'm remembering that Van Gogh was going to the seminary at one point in his life. Maybe there's a connection here. One of the connections is, whether conscious or unconscious, there may be some connection to prophecy. I don't want to overstate that, and I don't want to make a big thing about it. On the other hand, when you talk about in Hebrew a prophet, that's a navi, or in Arabic, nabi. And there's something about the root of that word that suggests a hollow reed, and that there was some understanding that the prophet was almost like a flute through which God played, Rumi talks about this, a reed cut from the reed bed, that makes the song of the flute. And the song of the flute is the song of you longing for the reed bed from which it's been cut. And, and for him, that's, that suggests a Sufi non-duality and relationship to God. But the prophet, in this sense, is the flute through which a music is played. And there's been this ancient connection between music and prophecy. That, in the Bible, some kings want to know what's going to happen in a battle and how it should go and how they should approach it. And they say, bring me a prophet. And the prophet Elisha comes running, and they say, make with a prophecy. And he responds, bring me a musician. Mm-hmm. They bring musicians, the musicians start to play, and he falls into a prophetic state. And so, if you've studied about shamanism, it's often the drum or a set of musical instruments that lead to an ecstatic state through which an other voice comes through, which is not a local voice, not my ego, but something from a deeper well comes up through echoing through that well. And so there's some relationship here, because in as much as the artist has that vague clarity that I was mentioning, whether it's a sound or feeling or the expression of an idea or the expression of idea visually, it catches hold of us, and then we listen harder, we look deeper, and we're trying to hone in, and the thing starts to come through and emerge, to press the surface, press through, push through, until it arrives at some sort of articulation. And I think we all know that there are varying degrees of this among artists, as an individual artist. There's the art you can make because you have the ability to make it. And then there's the art that seemed to push through. And it's the difference, I write poetry. I don't call myself a poet, but I do write poetry. I think there's a difference there between the deeper capacities. But even just as a writer of poetry, there have been poems that I've written because I'm connecting to some feeling, and I write the ideas, and sometimes it's pretty good. But then there is the poem that arrives, that rises up or comes like a revelation. And it may come kind of raw, and you may edit it later and make it a little sharper, but the raw thing was just there. And you almost feel like you can't take credit for it. Like, it didn't come from my thinking process. I got used. I was a vehicle. So there are these degrees, and so that's a definite connection for me. So prophecy, in as much as that we can talk about that in spiritual traditions, comes through the cultivation of states, and we might just more comfortably call it intuition now, or something else, but it does come through. And whether the artist thinks that they're spiritual or not, in as much as they're relating to deeper contents and honing in and having relationship to something that is almost like revelatory material for them, these may not be different processes. They may be different frames for the same process. And so I think there's a relationship between the artist and the prophet.
Mm-hmm. Another connection I'm seeing is between the training involved in creating art and the training involved in kind of following a spiritual religious tradition. Seems like in both cases, there can be this strong intuitive urge or yearning, and yet there's also a kind of skill or training involved in being able to actually manifest that vision. I'm sure in your paintings, you do things like these incredibly realistic, detailed portraits that, I'm over here like drawing stick figures. So even if I had a vision of a fully fledged portrait, I wouldn't have the ability to manifest that on a piece of paper. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that element, both of art, but maybe also of spirituality, and where they come together of, let's say, intuition or yearning and training and discipline.
My aunt, who was a mentor of mine growing up, even when I was a teenager, she would tell me stories from books. And one of the stories she used to tell me about was a kind of a tragedy of a figure in a book by Somerset Maugham called Of Human Bondage. And I think it was a young woman who wanted to be an artist desperately. And she did not have the chops. The skill was not there, but the desire was the desire of an artist and a passion for it. I think that that's a kind of tragedy of circumstances. Sometimes we want a thing that is not to be. On the other hand, we can miss our vocation that way. I was talking about like kind of being jealous of musicians. And after a while, I discovered that I did have a musical talent. And I have an ear for what is good. I know it almost immediately, couple bars, and I know it's got something underneath it, some depth or quality or power. I also have a good ear for putting a playlist together. That's my musical talent.
Something we
Like-
have in common.
Right. And it's like even if you got 10 great songs, there's a way to arrange them where they create a flow and an impact on consciousness where you go, that's a great playlist. And it wasn't the 10 songs. It was the way the 10 songs were arranged.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized, well, I love music. I know good music. I can't make it. Today, like I'm a DJ. Like I could be from that perspective, I could be a DJ.
Tunnel.
That's coming next. So that's where my joy is in the expression of the person, like, because I could be that figure like, oh, I wish I was a musician and I'm trying to make it, but I make crap art because I want to be a thing that I don't really have the skill for. Or I could appreciate where my talent is. As a visual artist, I did have that talent, and it was recognized pretty early, though I didn't grow up in a situation where it could get fostered very well. Like, I'm from a pretty poor family, and that's kind of an aberration, that makes me the strange thing in the environment. People thought it was cool, but, it wasn't an environment to raise an intellectual or to raise an artist.
Right.
So it mostly was just me doing it, in an uncluttered corner of the house as much as I could, drawing all the time. I actually, stole my first set of oil paints from the rec room of my grandmother's kind of elder care home.
Tisk tisk.
I, wandering around the building, I opened this closet and there were these oil paints, and man, they might have as well have been a spotlight on them. Kind of a revelatory moment.
Yeah.
And like I grabbed them, and I don't even know what possessed me to grab them, but I grabbed them and I went back to her apartment and I did my first oil painting, a little portrait of my grandfather, who was also a visual artist, a painter and a poet and so on. And it was pretty good. I mean, right from the start, it was pretty good. So talking about training, I didn't get much training, and it was pretty rebellious. But that doesn't mean that skill didn't get trained in me through working my natural talent and running up against my deficiencies and struggling to do better and so on.
I just want to interject for the listeners, because we don't have the art in front of you. Very likely have never seen Netanel's art. It is ridiculous that Netanel has not had formal training. These things are immaculate. So I just wanted to make that clear. That's kind of remarkable. But please, can you continue? Just what training did you feel like did happen? And how do you see that in relation to spiritual training? Because the same thing that you're talking about with aptitude and a natural kind of skill seems also pretty clear in terms of spiritual or religious vocations. Certain people from a very young age have deep intuitions, have deep connectedness, maybe just start praying as a child and very easily fall into prayer and connect to prayer in a way that other people raised in similar environments don't. And yet there's still that sense of honing something, of refining something.
Well, now that you bring it up, now I'm thinking about it differently. Like you were talking earlier, and I was thinking, oh, I've got a lot of deep spiritual training. But now I'm thinking, actually, my spiritual training followed the course of the artist too. I'm a pretty rebellious person by nature. Tell me to sit down, I stand up. Tell me to stand up, I stay seated. And it's not always a great quality. And I hope, at this age, I'm pretty grown up about it and don't just follow the rebellious impulses. They served me and didn't. The way they served me is that I always went my own way. Mm-hmm. Where it didn't serve me is, it was usually what you'd expect, too stubborn. But now looking back at spiritual training, I did the things. I did the things that you kind of need to do. I did the disciplined periods of meditation and getting up really early in the morning and so on. But I didn't do them because somebody told me to do them. That's part of my rebellion. It's like, I need to do it because it's an inner drive. And I know that these accomplishments, these, benchmarks need to be met in order to discover thresholds within. And I looked for, I needed teachers that could knock me on my ass. Because even though there was the kind of a weird thing in me, I was not very confident, some inner person in me was extremely confident. And it was that inner one that really needed to be impressed. And so, the people that impressed me, then I watched them very carefully. I paid attention to what they were doing, what they had done. And so that's just by way of example. I do think I went the same route, the artist route, with both things. The kind of training I did get in art, in visual art, was similar. I remember when I got into high school, there was an art teacher, a very nice man, Robert Klaus was his name. And, he's kind of the one art teacher in the high school, even though it was a big high school. And there's an art room. And he recognized my ability right away. And he became kind of a patron. I think he realized, couldn't really teach me. I wasn't very teachable, just because I was so stubborn. But he could let me go. He gave me materials, he said, I remember he cut me a piece of silver cord so I could do a silver point drawing. And he just cut it for me. He said, take it home and work with it. In those days, I was more of a sculptor. And I've always considered myself a better sculptor than a painter. And there was a back room in the art room that nobody went in. And he gave the room to me, basically labeled it mine and said, you just go back there and work. And you can come, if you can get out of a class, you can come here and work anytime. And I could keep my projects up in there. And so he really fostered that. He just let me work, and God bless him. And I think I always have a regret that I did not thank him enough because I was so rebellious and pushing my own agenda that I wasn't grateful enough to this man who was smart enough to deal with me in the right way.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing he had in that room was a lot of art books. And he basically gave them to me. I would take them home for weeks and just look at what the artists who had that thing that felt like it also belonged to me. And I was going home and I'm looking at their brushstrokes. I'm looking at what they did. I'm studying their intensity, studying their process. I'm reading about their lives. And that was, it was Van Gogh and it's Frida Kahlo and it was Diego Rivera, Modigliani, and so on. And I just spent time in my jealous pursuit of trying to reclaim from them what belonged to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so in those ways, I did study, trying to learn to mix a color. I had to do all that on my own. I had to make mistakes and try to do something like Frida Kahlo, also a self-taught painter.
Mm-hmm. If you're enjoying the episode, please consider subscribing to our Patreon to help support the production of the podcast.
Subscriptions begin at $1. All patrons receive access to bonus content, curated resources, and exclusive patron events, including live Q&As.
For more information, please check out the Patreon link in the show notes, and thanks for listening. The whole conversation around art, for me, really connects to something about new monasticism that we've talked about offline, which is this vision that you've articulated involves a kind of 24/7 spirituality, a kind of spirituality that embraces not only what we typically think of as spiritual or religious and involves specific kinds of practices, rituals, etc., but also a spirituality that embraces all the secular elements of life, not even wanting to make that distinction of secular and spiritual, just all of the elements of life And that was a lot of my interest in wanting to talk to you about art, because it seems like that's a whole element of your life that is clearly, at least from the outside, seems to be clearly a deep part of your spiritual life. And that even though some of your work does involve like iconography or imagery that is connected directly to kind of spiritual or religious themes, I think a lot of people wouldn't think of creating art necessarily as spiritual, or when maybe somebody was interested in, quote unquote, going deep in a pursuit of spiritual truth, all these quote unquote secular elements might be something that's to be seen as avoided or lessened or transformed in some ways. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to how, for you, artistry connects to that sense of a 24/7 kind of new monastic spirituality.
Yeah. I mean, in a real spiritual life, nothing's left out. I mean, where does it begin and end? If it begins and ends, then you got the problem of spirituality that, that it was a big complaint of the 20th century, a kind of Sunday spirituality, in a Christian context. Like, I'm religious on Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're religious on Sunday, you're not religious, it's not permeated your whole life. It's a societal duty that you do in order to be seen as a good Christian. And that seemed important to be seen to be,
Mm-hmm.
in a particular village or town or city or neighborhood. Oh, well, they go to church on Sunday, therefore they're Christian. But, pretty easy to read the problem in that, Once you get that accolade, you do whatever you want, behind the closed doors of your home. And, I had a pretty good insight when I was still pretty young that it's what happens inside me and what I do in private that almost matters more than anything. I want to qualify that because, as Batman's girlfriend confronts him with at certain points, she says, it's not what you feel, it's what you do. Now, that's true also.
Mm.
But I did have this insight that, who I am when nobody can see me or judge me and what decisions I make then, well, those are the decisions that represent and reflect my maturity. And that's pretty important. So where does it begin and end? And that means around spirituality that it's got to permeate everywhere. In fact, that's a definition of spirituality for some people, where it's not a word that is dualistic or polarized between secular and spiritual. That's how many people use spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
But there are those of us who use the word spiritual not in that polarized context. We use spiritual to mean permeating all of life. And I often say, I actually don't like to use the word. The only reason I use the word spiritual is because there are reductive materialists out there who say there's no transcendent dimension. There's nothing outside of what we know from science.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's bad science. Science should know its own ignorance and that it's a constant growing edge, which means it's always dealing with what we don't know. And so, that's why I use the word spiritual, because some people want to reduce life into this kind of poverty of simple knowns. And life is really the mystery. And so I like to talk about life in all caps. That's all there is. There's just life. And frankly, life is on the toilet. Life is eating. Life is in the hospital. Life is in the complexities of your sexual life and heartbreak. And it's just, there's nowhere it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I view spirituality. Unfortunately, spirituality is a pretty projected upon concept for most people that use it. And also it's been abused. So, I was alluding earlier to the artist archetype. Well, one of the pains for me as a so-called spiritual teacher, and I don't know what that means really. I have a sense, I talk about things and things that other people don't talk about. Okay, spiritual teacher. But one of the pains for me is like, can't talk about sex. Or as an artist, if I paint a naked body, because of the spiritual frame, that might be considered prurient, like pornography. And it's because people have this divorce in their minds. What is spiritual and what is not? Like, I don't know what is not spiritual, except pathologies and distortions of reality. You can distort sexuality. You can distort anything. I would agree with the problem of those things. But like, why can't, a naked body be spiritual?
Mm-hmm.
But we've had this problem of abuse among spiritual teachers and so on. So it's now like, oh, if he said the word fuck, now look out for that guy. So we need some sort of better discernment that allows for all of life to be present in our spirituality. I don't know how to fix that exactly, but it's all of our problem. I want these things to all be together in life. They're fairly artificial distinctions about whether Van Gogh was spiritual or not. I don't know how he could not be. If he did that, he's participating in the richness of human experience. And when I say human experience, I'm not talking about a non-transcendent thing. It's a holy mystery, this human experience. And he was right at the center of it. And like, was he spending his time talking about God? No, I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
It's a part of my spirituality when I connect with what he did. Or I connect with a certain piece of music, whether that person considered it spiritual or not, the way I connect with it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's muddy, and we need to get grown up around it. And it's almost an angry place in me that we're not grown up around it, because I feel so frustrated at the limitations that are put on the way I can talk,
Mm-hmm.
and how I can represent myself. The artist feels limited by the spiritual teacher projection. And that's one thing the artist hates, is getting limited by anything. Because the art wants to go and flow where it wants to flow.
Right.
It's not really asking permission. You can block it, but it just keeps pushing its agenda because it belongs to it somehow, the thing that's coming through. And is not just a mental construct and agenda of an artist, in quotes.
Mm-hmm.
The artist is in relationship to that thing that wants to come through. And that's part of what makes them an artist. The tension of the relationship, not the doing of the thing and have with more or less skill. That's an artisan. But the artist is in a tension relationship with the flow of being that wants to come through them and that revelatory expression.
It makes a lot of sense, the breaking down of the category of spiritual. This is a little challenge that arises for me around, but there's art that has that kind of spiritual quality. And then there's art that is created even just commercially as a part of commodity culture, which is a kind of lifelessness to it. And then there feels like there's more or less quote unquote spiritual ways to interact with art. And so I'm wondering, maybe it's just folly because you just broke down the distinction, but I'm curious if you can just speak a little bit, almost in a way of like providing us tips as a quote unquote spiritual artist. How do we embrace the spiritual nourishment and find that kind of spiritual nourishment within the art of others, as well as for artists among us in terms of our listeners? How do we connect our art to that kind of spiritual wellspring we were talking about? Is it just ineffable and those kind of distinctions don't matter? Or is there almost a way of orienting towards art, both the consumption and creation of art, that makes spirit more available, if you will?
I would say we're blessed with an amazing faculty we have this faculty that can discern quality.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at the Latin of qua. Qua means whatness. Quality is like getting at an essence. And if I put it in the terms of visual art, I have seen paintings that are technically far, far, superior to what I can do.
Mm-hmm.
There are artists with a technical ability that far, far exceeds mine. And yet they felt like completely empty.
Mm-hmm.
It's technical. It's not lacking in technical skill quality, but when I talk about quality, I usually mean the whatness, the essence, the felt intensity and raw power of communication. Does it communicate something to me? And so, as I said, when I'm looking at paintings in a gallery, I might walk by masterworks and I don't stand there and stare at them.
Mm-hmm.
If they didn't have the power to grab me, and maybe that's all just my ego, but I don't care. It's what grabs me that I care about. And I feel, it's just a personal view, that that's been painted into them.
Mm.
It's easier to talk about with voice and music, or music in general. For a few years, long ago, I studied with a Moroccan Kabbalist. And he had this way of just kind of turning around and shocking me, or asking me really challenging questions. And, once he showed me a photo and he said, "What do you see there?" Just kind of challenging question. And I remember looking at the photo of a person and I said, "Innocence." He said, "Yeah, but what kind?"
Mm.
And I said, "I can't quite express it." And he said, "Conscious innocence." And there's a difference between conscious innocence and general ignorance. And one day he played me some music from Morocco of a traditional singer singing love songs to God.
Mm.
And he again was testing me, he's like, "Does he have the best voice?" And I was like, "Well, that's probably not how they record the album in the studio,
Mm-hmm.
They would fine tune it and so on." And said, "Maybe he doesn't have the best voice." And I said, "But it's amazing. It's amazing." And he says, "Yes, because he's not performing.
Mm.
He doesn't care about you. He's singing to God. He's singing to God." And you could tell he was not performing. He was singing to God. And something broke through. So there was something underneath the notes, something of that human longing and yearning and passion that was communicated that was better than the virtuoso,
Mm-hmm.
who could attenuate their vocal cords and voice in such a way to create a certain kind of mastery of sound, but whose the content of their sound might be empty. It was full of content. And there's some quality, or capacity in us to recognize that, to tell the difference between pop music, manufactured in the factory of all pop music today, and the difference between that and Nina Simone, whose every word seems to have reference and mean something in a life that she's lived that has been rich and deep and full of pain. And I think this is a reason that I connect so much with Hasidism, because so much of Hasidism is based in the notion that we can invest kavanah, powerful intentionality, into every action and make those actions true instead of the pathetic things they usually are. Half invested in, I did it unwillingly, you feel all my ambivalence in the thing that I wrote you, in the thing I said to you. Hasidism taught me you can put power into a word. You can mean it. You can put power into an action. You can harness all the cells of your being and focus them and deliver them into one action, whether it be a kiss, whether it be a punch,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be a word of prayer, whether it be a song, a brushstroke. And I think that that's how the spirituality gets into the art. Like, we have to get clear about our intentions when we do it.
Mm-hmm.
Or else you can have two remarkably different things which could look the same to the undiscerning observer. Well, that's all music, is it? Is, whoever is doing music from the factory doing the same thing that Nina Simone is doing? Not to me.
Mm-hmm. And there's something elusive about that kind of quality, because you see it, individual artists don't make a masterpiece every time. There may be a musical artist that creates one amazing album and then is never able to recreate it or live up to it, or even a song. And I think painters, the same. Like, all artists, there's something almost ineffable and elusive around it. And I've had numerous conversations with other artists around the kind of irony that oftentimes the things that you're initially think are going to be incredible, very good, you finish them, and after some time you're like, oh, that's not that good. Mm-hmm. And the thing you thought was kind of not good enough to even be made ends up being amazing. I'm thinking of this story of the Beatles, their song Hey Jude. I read that it was originally written for, the son of one of the bandmates whose parents were going through a divorce. I don't remember who, but it was just written as a personal, private thing for that one person. And they were like, oh, it's not good enough. Like, it's just this little thing I wrote. We're not going to turn that into a song. And, now it's Hey Jude. So there's something kind of amazing about that quality. But I'm wondering, you spoke to this kind of intentionality in terms of creating art. Would you say the same thing in terms of interacting with art as a viewer or consumer, that it has to do with a kind of totalizing attention? Like, we have to allow ourselves to be absorbed in the kind of art to really appreciate it?
Not entirely. Like, I don't want to put a trip on it. Like, sometimes, you just enjoy a beat and whatever. But I do think there are levels to things. And if it's visual art, it might be, well, it could be any kind of art, but let's use visual art as an example. Like, on those museum tours, I never put on the headphones. Like, I don't want people to tell me what to look at. Mm-hmm. I don't want them to tell me what's important. If I'm there to be in relationship to. Mm-hmm. And I want to feel called to relationship. All that's to say that I'm in for a contemplative life. And that's part of a contemplative life, to be close to the experience and to be reflecting on the experience and keep reinvesting back into it and keep reflecting and keep investing back into it and see where I'm called to look, and even examining how I feel about certain things, even if I don't immediately know why I feel. I feel drawn to this painting. Is it the yellow? Is it the object in the painting? And watching that moment and then being with that moment mm-hmm. is, I think, how we can get enriched by anything in our lives. So that's a contemplative life to me, where close to the examination of this mystery. I just don't, at this point in my life, though I've done a lot of very specific spiritual practices, if you ask me what my main practice is today, even though I still do traditional practices, my main practice is examining the minutiae of my experience. Why was I a little bit irritable in that situation? Why did I feel tension then? Can I not do that next time? Mm-hmm. That it's all like grist for the mill now. It's a contemplative life. And I think that's how we can get more out of what artists spread around.
Yeah.
And then there's that weird thing that we all have as artists, like, we want it to be appreciated somewhere. And yet, if you did it for that reason, it wouldn't be good art.
Mm-hmm.
But then it also, you want it to continue to have a life. You want it to have a life.
Yeah. Yeah, you saying that just brought a little phrase to mind, which is something like live close to your own life, or applied to art, live close to your own art. There's almost this sense of just showing up in presence with it. So this has been really fun. I'm wondering if you have just any lingering thoughts on this kind of general topic of the intersection of art and spirituality.
Mm-hmm. One thing I just thought of was, like we want our art to have a life. That's Pinocchio. That's Pinocchio, like you made this thing and you want it to live and go live a life beyond you. And I think that that's part of what makes it better art. When it's good art, you have that desire and it also does live, goes on and inspires and does something of that. Had a really interesting experience once where, I was living in a downstairs apartment. And so there's an upstairs too. And somebody was visiting upstairs. And the person visiting was a shaman. And, they had an appointment with a person upstairs and came into the house. And upstairs are a few of my paintings hanging. And the shaman turned and looked down the hallway at a very large painting of mine. And immediately, grabbed the hand of the person who'd let them in and said, "Who painted that?" And they were told, it was me. And they said, "I need to see them." And showed them the other paintings too. "I need to see them." And so I came upstairs to see this person. And the shaman says to me, "Your paintings are praying." I said, "They're praying?" She says, "Yes, they're alive. They're praying." And I got it. I understood what she was saying. And to me, it was a little bit of, well, good. Of course. That's the intention, that they should be awake and alive. And so that she was a person that could recognize that. She said, "What did you do when you were painting them?" Because they pray. They're living things, and they're also things that are doing holy work, she was telling me. And I thought, well, really nothing special for me, except that maybe I have these beliefs. I have these intentions. It doesn't mean that I'm always sitting there sweating and concentrating on pushing intensity into the painting. Sometimes. But sometimes that's a background desire that is coming through me. And it seemed to be working, at least according to this person. Mm-hmm. So I think it's possible to express our depths through this work. And the work doesn't have to be, like the artist archetype could express in an accountant, in a technical writer. Like, where does it come in? How does it come in? We can put kavanah into anything. We can live an artistic / spiritual life. And it depends on how we approach it. So those are the last things that were coming up for me around this.
Great. Thank you so much. And as we do, I'd just like to offer some space for you to close us out with a poem or song or something, if you have anything that you'd like to share.
Yeah, I was thinking about it. And one thing that came to me is the remarkable opening to a very small book, one of my favorite books. It's by Annie Dillard, and the book is called Holy the Firm, Holy the Firm. And as I think about it now, a lot of people know Annie Dillard from Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, but I think this is a masterpiece of hers, this very short little book called Holy the Firm. And in some ways, she's talking about that contemplative life of an artist and how the artist is experiencing the media of life, and it's filtering through them and coming out in different ways. And I think this book is an expression of that. And her opening paragraph expresses a way of life for me, at least one that I aspire to and mostly fail at achieving. But it goes like this. And it's just the very beginning. Every day is a God. Each day is a God. and holiness holds forth in time. I worship each God. I praise each day splintered down and wrapped in time like a husk of many colors spreading at dawn fast over the mountains split. I wake in a God.
Beautiful. Amen.
Amen.
Cheers, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye. Shout out to friend of the show, Treefort of Golden Turtle Sound, for producing the intro and outro music and assisting with mixing and mastering. Be sure to check out his awesome music and hit up Golden Turtle Sound for any of your audio engineering needs.